The rain in Boston did not wash things clean. It only made the filth slicker, the cobblestones more treacherous, the darkness more complete. On the night of October 18th, 1875, in the rotting heart of the North End, a woman was about to be buried alive. Daniel Blackwood did not know this yet. He was simply a man on a horse riding through the industrial wasteland at 2 in the morning, trying to find his way to the train station. At 34 years old, he had the look of someone who had stopped caring about appearances. His duster coat was stained with 3 years of frontier mud. His hat sat low over eyes that had forgotten how to hope. He had just finished a surveying contract for the Union Pacific Railroad, mapping geological formations for routes that would never bear his name. In 12 hours, he would board a westbound train and return to the Wyoming Territory, to the homestead where he lived alone, to the silence that had become his only companion since Sarah died. The sound reached him first, a muffled cry, thin as spider silk, barely audible over the drum of rain on brick. Daniel pulled his horse to a halt. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip. 3 years in Wyoming had taught him that unusual sounds in the dark usually meant trouble, and trouble usually meant someone was about to die. He dismounted and moved toward the vacant lot, boots squelching in mud that smelled of sewage and industrial runoff. The lantern light from a distant street barely penetrated the gloom, but it was enough. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. 2 men stood at the edge of a hole they had dug into the soft earth. The hole was 4 feet deep, just deep enough to bury someone standing upright. And in that hole, bound hand and foot with rough hemp rope, mouth gagged with filthy cloth, stood a young woman. Her eyes were wide with terror that had moved beyond screaming into the cold realm of acceptance. She knew she was about to die. The taller of the 2 men, a brute with a face like a sledgehammer, was shoveling dirt into the hole. Each shovelful landed on the woman's shoulders, her chest beginning the slow suffocation that would end her life. The other man, smaller, but with the cruel efficiency of a professional, was giving instructions. Boss Grayson said, "Make it slow. He wants the other debtors to hear about this, wants them to know what happens when you try to run." Daniel did not announce himself. He simply drew his Colt and stepped into the lantern light. "Step away from the hole." Both men spun. The one with the shovel dropped it. The smaller man, whose name Daniel would later learn was Barlow, reached for a pistol tucked into his belt. Daniel shot him in the leg. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the brick warehouses like the voice of God pronouncing judgment. Barlow screamed and fell, clutching his shattered kneecap. The bigger man looked at his fallen companion, looked at Daniel, and made a calculation that probably saved his life. He ran. Barlow tried to crawl after him, leaving a trail of blood in the mud. Daniel let him go. There would be time for justice later. Right now, a woman was drowning in earth. He holstered his pistol and jumped into the hole. The woman shrank away from him, terrified that her tormentors had simply been replaced. Daniel worked quickly, cutting the ropes with his skinning knife, pulling the gag from her mouth. She gasped, sucking air into lungs that had been preparing to stop. "Easy," Daniel said, his voice deliberately calm, the tone he used with frightened horses. "I am not going to hurt you. My name is Daniel. You are safe now." She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much betrayal to believe in safety. But when he lifted her out of the hole and set her on solid ground, when he draped his coat over her shoulders and stepped back to give her space, something in her rigid terror began to crack. "They were going to bury me," she whispered. "They were going to bury me alive." "I know," Daniel said, "but they are gone now. Can you walk?" She tried and nearly collapsed. Daniel caught her, feeling how thin she was beneath the soaked dress, how she trembled like a bird that had flown too long against the wind. He lifted her onto his horse and swung up behind her, keeping a careful distance, even as he guided the animal toward the lights of the city center. "Where are we going?" Her voice was small, defeated. "Somewhere warm," Daniel said. "Somewhere safe. And then you are going to tell me who those men were and why they wanted you dead." By the time they reached Boston, Union Station, dawn was still 2 hours away, but the first trains were being prepared for their runs west. The station waiting room was warm, heated by a massive coal stove and mostly empty. Daniel found a bench near the stove and settled the woman onto it. Up close, in better light, he could see she was young, perhaps 24, with the kind of face that would have been pretty if it were not so haunted. Her hands were bruised, her wrists raw from the ropes. "Tell me," Daniel said, sitting across from her to maintain a respectful distance. And she did. Her name was Eleanor Ashford. Ellie, to those who had cared about her back when there were people who cared. Her father had been a tailor, a good one, but the Panic of '73 had destroyed his business. In desperation, he had borrowed $2,000 from a man named Vincent Grayson. Grayson was not a banker. He was something worse. A predator who specialized in lending to the desperate and then collecting in ways that made men wish they had never been born. Her father had died 6 months ago. Heart failure, the doctor said, but Ellie knew it was the debt that killed him. The crushing weight of owing more than he could ever repay. And when Thomas Ashford died, the debt did not die with him. It transferred to his only child like an inheritance of poison. Grayson had given Ellie 30 days to pay. When she could not, he had offered her an alternative. She could work off the debt in one of his establishments. The word he used was work. The reality was slavery of a kind that made her skin crawl. She had tried to run. That had been her mistake. Grayson's men found her hiding in a boarding house in the Irish Quarter. They dragged her to that vacant lot, and they began to dig. He told them to make it slow, Ellie said, her voice barely audible, so other people would hear about it, so they would know not to run. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he had not felt in 3 years. "I understand what it feels like to lose everything." Ellie looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. "You have debts too." "No, but I lost my wife, Sarah, 3 years ago. She died giving birth to our first child. The baby did not survive either." The tears came then, unbidden and unwanted. The first he had shed since the day he buried them both on a windswept hillside in Wyoming. He turned away, ashamed of his weakness, but Ellie reached out and touched his hand. "I am sorry," she said. "Do not be. We are both survivors. That is enough." They sat in silence for a while, two broken people in a train station at dawn, each carrying wounds that would never fully heal. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "Grayson will look for you. Boston is not safe anymore." "I know, but I have nowhere to go, no money, no family." Daniel made a decision that would change both their lives. "I am going back to Wyoming. I have land there, a homestead near a place called Silverstone Ridge. No one knows you there. Grayson would never find you. Why would you help me? You do not even know me." "Because 3 years ago I could not save anyone. I could not save Sarah. I could not save my child. But tonight I saved you. And maybe that is a sign. Maybe that means I can still do something that matters." Ellie studied his face, searching for the lie, the hidden price. She had learned to expect payment for every kindness, but she saw only sincerity and a grief that matched her own. "What would I do in Wyoming? You would be safe. You would be free. And when you are ready, if you want to leave, you can go anywhere. I am not a jailer. I am just offering you a chance. And you want nothing from me. I want you to live. That is all." She believed him, perhaps because she had no other choice. Perhaps because she saw in his eyes the same desperate need for redemption that burned in her own heart. "Then I will go with you." Daniel bought her a ticket with money he had earned mapping stone and soil. He bought her bread and hot coffee from the station vendor. She ate like someone who had not known kindness in a very long time, each bite a small miracle. As they waited for the 6 o'clock train, Daniel told her about Wyoming, about the vast emptiness of it, the way the sky seemed to go on forever, the way a person could ride for days without seeing another soul. He did not tell her about the bunker beneath his barn, about the fortune in water rights he was sitting on, about the war brewing between him and Marcus Thornfield. There would be time for those truths later. For now, it was enough that she was alive. It was enough that for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond simple survival. The train west was a ribbon of smoke and steel cutting through the American landscape like a surgeon's knife. Daniel and Ellie sat in third class, surrounded by Swedish immigrants and fortune seekers and people fleeing lives they could no longer bear. She sat by the window watching Boston disappear into memory and did not speak for the first 12 hours. Daniel gave her space. He sat across from her, his hat pulled low, and appeared to sleep. But he was watching her from beneath the brim, making sure she did not bolt, making sure she felt safe enough to breathe. The first night, she barely slept. Every time the train lurched or another passenger moved, she would jolt awake, eyes wide, ready to run. Daniel understood. He had been the same way after Sarah died, startling at shadows, unable to trust that the world would not take everything again. The second day, as the green hills of Pennsylvania gave way to the endless flatness of the Midwest, Ellie finally spoke. "Tell me about her, about Sarah." So he did. And in the telling, the memories came flooding back with a vividness that hurt like a reopened wound. He had met Sarah in the spring of '71. She had been a teacher's daughter from Laramie, with a laugh that could light up a room and a mind sharp enough to match his own fascination with maps and geology. They married after a courtship of 3 months, built a small cabin together on the land he had claimed near what would become Silverstone Ridge. She was 28, he was 30. They were going to raise children and build an empire and grow old watching sunsets from their porch. She got pregnant almost immediately. They were both delighted. Daniel built a cradle from pine wood. Sarah sewed tiny clothes and sang to the child growing inside her. They argued good-naturedly about names. Daniel wanted James if it was a boy. Sarah insisted on Thomas. The pregnancy was difficult. She was sick, often could not keep food down, grew thin instead of round. But she smiled through it, insisted she was fine, made Daniel promise not to worry. The labor began on a February night in '72. Snow was falling thick and heavy, cutting them off from the nearest town. The midwife could not get through the drifts. It was just Daniel and Sarah, and the terrible realization that something was wrong. The baby was too big. Sarah was too small. For 18 hours she pushed and bled and screamed, and Daniel held her hand and felt utterly helpless. When the midwife finally arrived, it was too late. The baby was stillborn, and Sarah, who had fought so hard to bring life into the world, bled out in the bed they had shared. Her last words were a command. "Promise me you will not bury your heart with me. Promise me you will find someone to love again. Promise me you will live, Danny, for both of us." He had promised, and then he had broken that promise for 3 years. Living but not alive, surviving but not thriving, a ghost haunting his own life. On the train telling Ellie this story, Daniel wept. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a man in control, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone finally releasing a grief too long contained. Ellie did not try to comfort him. She simply sat with him in his pain, a witness to his breaking, and that was enough. When the tears finally stopped, Daniel felt lighter, as if Sarah's spirit had been waiting all this time for him to mourn properly, to let her go so he could move forward. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Ellie said quietly. "She was, and she made me promise to live. Tonight, when I saved you, I felt like I was finally keeping that promise." Ellie looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but also something else, recognition perhaps, the understanding that passes between two people who have both stared into the abyss. The train arrived in Cheyenne on the afternoon of October 24th. The town was a frontier boom town, all mud streets and false-fronted buildings, and men who had come west to reinvent themselves or die trying. Saloons roared with piano music and laughter. Cowboys drove cattle through the streets. Women in painted silk smiled from balcony windows. Ellie stepped off the train and looked around with eyes that had seen too much city squalor to be impressed by frontier chaos. "It looks like Boston," she said, "just with more dust and fewer bricks. Silverstone Ridge is quieter, much quieter. 2 days' ride from here. You will not see another person for weeks." "That sounds perfect." They were walking toward the livery stable when Ellie stopped suddenly, her face going pale. Daniel followed her gaze to a notice posted on the wall of the post office. "Reward $500. Eleanor Ashford, crime theft of property belonging to Vincent Grayson. Contact Boston Marshal Office." "He reported me as a thief," Ellie whispered. "He is hunting me." Daniel tore the notice down and crumpled it. "Not in Wyoming. Here no one cares what Boston wants. As long as you do not cause trouble, you are invisible." "But what if he sends someone?" What if they come for me? Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he spoke carefully. There is a way to make you legally untouchable, a loophole in territorial law. What kind of loophole? If you were married to someone with a homestead claim, Grayson could not extradite a married woman from another territory without your husband's consent, and I would never give that consent. Ellie stared at him. You are asking me to marry you. I am offering you legal protection, nothing more. We would live separately. I would sleep in the barn. You would have the house. When you want to leave, you are free to go. This would just be on paper, to keep you safe. She searched his face for deception, for the trap, for the price that men like Grayson always demanded. But she saw only honesty and a desperate desire to help. And you would expect nothing from me. No intimacy. Nothing. I am not Grayson. I do not buy people. I am just trying to help someone who needs help. Ellie took a deep breath. It was insane. She had known this man for less than a week. But he had saved her life, treated her with respect, shared his deepest pain. And the alternative was to keep running until Grayson's men found her. Then yes, I will marry you, on paper. They found a circuit preacher in a small church on the edge of town. The man looked skeptical at first. Marriages of convenience were common on the frontier, usually involving prostitutes looking for legitimacy or widows seeking protection. But when Daniel paid him $5, twice the usual fee, his skepticism vanished. The ceremony was brief. Daniel Blackwood, do you take Eleanor Ashford as your lawful wife? I do. Eleanor Ashford, do you take Daniel Blackwood as your lawful husband? I do. By the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. They did not kiss. They simply signed the certificate and walked out into the Wyoming afternoon as husband and wife-in-law, if not in truth. Outside the church, Ellie spoke softly. Thank you for not abandoning me. Someone once taught me to live, to help others live. Tonight I am doing that. What happens now? Now we ride to Silverstone Ridge, to your new home, to your new life. As they rode out of Cheyenne, heading into the vast emptiness of the Wyoming Territory, Ellie looked back one last time at civilization. Ahead lay wilderness mystery danger, but also hope. For the first time since her father died, she felt like she might have a future. And Daniel, riding beside her, felt the ghost of Sarah's hand on his shoulder, blessing this strange union, releasing him from his vow of solitude. The sun was setting as they left the town behind, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere ahead, in a valley surrounded by stone cliffs, a homestead waited, a sod house and a leaning barn, and secrets buried deep in the earth. But that was tomorrow's discovery. Tonight they were simply two survivors riding toward a second chance, two broken people choosing to trust one more time, two souls who had lost everything learning to hope again. And behind them in Boston, Vincent Grayson was already planning his revenge, because men like Grayson never forgave a debt, and they never let their property escape. The chase had only just begun. The journey from Cheyenne to Silverstone Ridge took 2 days. 2 days of riding through a landscape so vast and empty, it made Eleanor Ashford feel like the last woman on earth. The plains gave way to foothills, the foothills to mountains, and finally, as the sun began to set on the second day, they crested a ridge, and Daniel pointed to a valley below. There, he said, home. Ellie looked down and felt her heart sink. She had prepared herself for poverty. Daniel had warned her, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of what she saw. A sod house literally carved into the side of a hill with a front wall of stacked logs and packed earth. It looked less like a dwelling and more like something a desperate animal might burrow into to escape a storm. Beside it, a barn leaned at an angle that seemed to defy the laws of physics, its roof patched with rusted tin and more sod. There were no other structures, no neighbors, no signs of civilization beyond the narrow trail they had followed here. This was not a homestead. This was exile. Daniel must have seen the shock on her face because his voice became defensive. I told you it was not much. You told me it was simple. This is... She searched for a word that would not sound like an accusation. This is very simple. They rode down into the valley as dusk gathered. Up close, the sod house looked even worse. The door was heavy oak, oddly thick for such a primitive structure, secured with an iron bolt that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. The windows were small, more like gun slits than sources of light. Daniel dismounted and helped Ellie down. She stood in the yard looking at what was supposedly her new home and fought the urge to cry. "I will show you inside," Daniel said quietly. The interior was a single room. A cast-iron stove squatted in one corner, radiating dying heat. A rough table and 2 chairs occupied the center. Against the far wall stood a bed covered in animal furs. The floor was packed earth, swept clean, but still dirt. The walls were lined with old newspapers to keep the soil from crumbling. It was cleaner than Ellie had expected, but it was still a cave. "You take the bed," Daniel said. "I will sleep in the barn." Ellie turned to him, suddenly afraid. In Boston, men who offered help always demanded payment. Always. The fact that Daniel had not yet asked for anything only meant the bill was coming due. "You do not have to sleep in the barn. This is your house. I made you a promise in Cheyenne. I keep my promises." He grabbed a bedroll from a trunk and headed for the door. Ellie found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "Daniel, why are you doing this?" "Really, no one is this kind without wanting something." He stopped his hand on the door latch. When he turned back, his eyes held a sadness so deep it made her own pain seem small. "Because I failed Sarah. I could not save her. I could not save our child. For 3 years I have been living in this house like a ghost, going through the motions of existing, but not really alive. And then I saw you in that hole about to be buried, and something inside me woke up. Saving you made me feel human again. That is what I want. Not your body, not your servitude. Just the chance to prove that I can still protect someone, that I am not completely broken." The raw honesty of it left Ellie speechless. She watched him walk out into the darkness toward the leaning barn, and for the first time since her father died, she felt something other than fear. She felt safe. But safety, she would learn, was an illusion in Wyoming. That night, Ellie lay on the bed, fully clothed, afraid to undress, afraid to let her guard down. Every sound made her jump. The wind howling through the eaves, the scurry of mice in the walls, the creak of settling timbers. She tried to sleep, but her mind kept replaying the moment in the hole, the dirt falling on her shoulders, the certainty of death approaching, shovelful by shovelful. Sometime after midnight, the nightmare came. She was back in the hole, but this time Barlow was not alone. Vincent Grayson stood above her, impeccably dressed, smiling his predator's smile. He was pouring dirt into the hole himself, slowly, methodically making it last. Her mouth filled with soil, her lungs burned. She could not scream, could not breathe, could not... She woke, gasping, her own scream echoing in the small room. Before she could orient herself, the door burst open and Daniel was there, rifle in hand, eyes scanning for threats. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Ellie pulled her knees to her chest, trembling violently. I dreamed they were burying me again." Daniel lowered the rifle and sat down on one of the chairs, carefully maintaining distance between them. In the dim light from the dying stove, his face looked carved from stone. "You are safe here. Grayson cannot reach you, I promise." "Why," the word came out broken, desperate, "why are you kind to me? No one has ever asked for nothing in return. Because you deserve kindness. Everyone does. And because Sarah made me promise to live. Helping you helps me keep that promise." The tears came, then a torrent of fear and relief and exhaustion. Ellie cried for her father, for the life she had lost, for the terror of nearly dying in that Boston hole. And Daniel sat with her through it, not touching, not speaking, just present, a witness to her breaking. When the tears finally stopped, Ellie felt hollowed out but strangely lighter. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For letting me cry. Grayson always said crying was weakness. My father said ladies should never show emotion, but you just let me be human." "Being human is all we have left," Daniel said. "Now try to sleep. Tomorrow I will show you how to protect yourself, so you never feel helpless again." He left her alone with that promise, and this time when Ellie closed her eyes, she slept without dreaming. Morning came cold and bright. Ellie woke to find Daniel already outside, checking the perimeter of the property with the systematic thoroughness of a military scout. When he saw her emerge from the house wrapped in the blanket he had given her, he waved her over. "I need to check the fence line to the north. Do you want to come?" The thought of being alone in that sod house made her skin crawl. "Yes, I do not want to stay here by myself." "Good. Then I will teach you something useful." He led her to the area behind the house where the valley opened into a small meadow. There he had set up 5 tin cans on a split-rail fence. From a saddlebag he pulled out a Winchester rifle. "This is for you," he said, offering it to her. Ellie stared at the weapon like it was a snake. "I have never held a gun. That is why I am going to teach you. If I am away and someone comes, you need to be able to defend yourself." "I could not shoot anyone." 3 days ago, you thought you could not survive being buried alive. But you did. People are stronger than they think when survival is at stake. Ellie took the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, cold, and somehow alive in her hands. Daniel moved behind her, not touching, but guiding with his words. "Feet shoulder-width apart. Stock tight against your shoulder. Look down the barrel. See the front sight. Line it up with the target. Breathe out slowly. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull." Ellie did as instructed. The rifle bucked like a living thing, the recoil slamming into her shoulder hard enough to make her stagger. The bullet went wide, kicking up dirt 20 feet from the nearest can. "I missed." "Everyone misses the first time. Try again." She tried and missed, and tried again, and missed again. On the 5th attempt, her shoulder aching, her arms trembling from the weight of the rifle, she squeezed the trigger and heard the beautiful sound of metal hitting metal. The can flew off the fence. Ellie gasped, then laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in months, and the sound startled them both. "I hit it. I actually hit it." Daniel was smiling, and she realized it was the first time she had seen him smile. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less haunted. "You did. You are a natural." For the next hour they practiced. By the end, Ellie could hit 3 cans out of 5. Her shoulder was bruised, her hands sore, but she felt something she had not felt since her father died. She felt capable, powerful, like she could defend herself against the world. As she handed the rifle back to Daniel, their hands touched. She did not flinch. The contact was brief, accidental, but it marked a shift. She was starting to trust him. "Thank you," she said, "for teaching me to fight. You always knew how to fight, Eleanor. You just needed the tools." They walked back toward the house together, and that was when Ellie noticed something odd. The barn, which looked decrepit from the outside, seemed wrong somehow. She could not put her finger on it at first. Then her seamstress eye, trained to notice when hems did not hang straight or when patterns did not align, caught the discrepancy. The barn was 30 feet deep from the outside, but the back wall visible through gaps in the siding was only 20 feet in. 10 feet of space had disappeared. Daniel had gone inside to make coffee. Ellie stood in the yard staring at the barn, calculating angles and distances. The more she looked, the more certain she became. There was a hidden space inside that structure. Curiosity battled with the promise she had made to herself not to pry into Daniel's business. Curiosity won. She crossed to the barn and slipped through the half-open door. Inside was exactly what she expected from a frontier barn. Rusted tools, moldy hay, broken harnesses, the smell of horses and time. She moved toward the back wall, picking her way through the debris. The hay bales at the rear were stacked too neatly, too deliberately. She pulled one aside and found canvas tarp. Behind the tarp, painted black to blend with shadows, was a door. Not a barn door. A bank vault door. Steel reinforced. With a combination lock wheel in the center. Ellie's breath caught. Daniel was not a poor farmer. He was a criminal. A bank robber hiding stolen money. That explained the poverty facade, the isolation, the paranoia. She was about to flee when she noticed something else. The ground near the vault door was not packed earth like the rest of the barn. It was wood covered with a thin layer of dust to disguise it. A trapdoor. With trembling hands, she found the iron ring and pulled. The door swung open smoothly, revealing a ladder descending into darkness, but not total darkness. A faint glow emanated from below the chemical light of kerosene lamps. Ellie knew she should stop, knew she should respect Daniel's privacy, but the same survival instinct that had kept her alive in Boston was screaming at her to know what kind of man she had married. If there were bodies down there, she needed to know. If there was danger, she needed to be prepared. She descended the ladder. The space below was not a cellar. It was an office, a command center. Brick walls reinforced with timber, shelves lined with books and geological samples, each carefully labeled, a massive drafting table covered in maps. And in the corner, gleaming in the lamplight, a telegraph machine with wires running up through the ceiling. Ellie moved to the drafting table as if in a trance. The largest map showed the entire region professionally surveyed and color-coded. Most of the territory was marked in red with the label Marcus Thornfield Holdings. But running through the center like a vein of precious metal was a thin line of blue. Silverstone Aquifer, primary access point, deed holder Daniel Blackwood. On the desk beside the map sat a leather-bound ledger. Ellie opened it with hands that had started shaking again. May 1874. M. Thornfield. Offer number 1, $5,000. Declined. August 1874. M. Thornfield. Offer number 2, $10,000. Declined. October 1874. M. Thornfield. Offer number 3, $50,000. Declined. $50,000. Daniel had turned down $50,000. More money than Ellie would see in 10 lifetimes. More money than had driven her father to his grave, chasing a fraction of it. Daniel was not poor. He was rich. Possibly one of the richest men in Wyoming territory, and he had let her believe he was a struggling homesteader, barely surviving. "I told you not to come down here." Ellie spun. Daniel stood at the bottom of the ladder, his face unreadable. "You lied to me." Her voice shook with anger and betrayal. "You said you were a simple farmer, but this—" She gestured at the maps, the telegraph, the evidence of wealth. "This is an empire." "I did not lie. I said I had land. I do. But I never said I was poor." "You live in a dirt house. You wear boots held together with twine. You let everyone think you are destitute, because if anyone knew the truth, I would be dead within a week." The flat certainty in his voice stopped her anger cold. Daniel moved to the map and placed his hand on the blue line. 5 years ago, I was surveying this region for the Union Pacific. I found this aquifer, pure, clean water in quantities that could supply a city. I filed the deed claim before telling anyone, including my partner, Marcus Thornfield. When Marcus found out, he was furious. He had already bought thousands of acres of land around here, thinking he owned the water rights. But he did not. I did. So you stole it from him. I protected it from him. Marcus is a cruel man. If he controlled this water, he would charge farmers 20 times what it is worth. He would strangle every homesteader in the valley, force them to sell their land for pennies, and build himself a kingdom on their suffering. But you are not using the water either, because the moment I start selling water rights, Marcus will find a way to take them. He has tried to buy me out 3 times. When I refused, he tried intimidation. He burned my original barn. He sent men to threaten me. He will not stop until he owns this aquifer, or I am dead. Ellie looked at the ledger again, at the astronomical sums Daniel had rejected. "So you pretend to be poor to survive." "I pretend to be poor to keep others safe. If I sold that water to Marcus, 400 families would lose their farms. Children would starve. Good people would be destroyed. I cannot let that happen, even if it costs you everything. I already lost everything when Sarah died. This," he touched the map gently, "this gives me purpose, a reason to keep fighting." Ellie was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what she had discovered. Then she asked the question that had been forming since she saw the telegraph machine. "Who else knows?" "Only one man. Sam Garrett, a freight hauler in Laramie. He is the closest thing I have to a friend. And Marcus knows I have the water rights. He does not know about this bunker. He does not know about the telegraph. He thinks I am just a stubborn fool sitting on land I am too ignorant to monetize." "But you are not ignorant. You are playing a much deeper game." Daniel looked at her with something approaching respect. "You are perceptive." "I have had to be. Men like Vincent Grayson taught me to look for the truth behind the lies." Before Daniel could respond, they heard it. The sound of horses, multiple horses, coming fast. Daniel's hand went to the pistol at his hip. "Stay here. Lock the trapdoor behind me." Who is it? Either Marcus coming to make another offer or something worse. He climbed the ladder quickly. Ellie followed, ignoring his command to stay hidden. From the barn door, they could see 5 riders entering the valley. The man at the front rode a magnificent black stallion and wore a suit that looked absurdly expensive for the frontier. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, carrying a walking stick with a silver head. "Marcus Thornfield," Daniel said quietly. His voice carried the weight of old hatred. The riders stopped 20 feet from the sod house. Marcus Thornfield dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man who owned everything he surveyed. His eyes swept over the crude dwelling, the leaning barn, and finally settled on Daniel. "Daniel Blackwood, it has been too long, old friend." "We are not friends, Marcus." "What do you want?" "I heard a rumor that you had taken a wife, a mail-order bride from Boston." His gaze shifted to Ellie, and she felt it like a physical touch. Oily, invasive, calculating. "She is very pretty, too pretty for a dirt farmer. Leave her out of this." "Oh, but she is very much in this. You see, I have been wondering, why would a man who has rejected every offer, who has lived like a hermit for 3 years, suddenly decide he needs a wife?" And then it occurred to me, the Homestead Act. A married man can claim twice the acreage. You are securing more land, making it harder for me to acquire access routes. Daniel said nothing, but Ellie saw his jaw clench. Marcus smiled. It was the smile of a snake that had just located a mouse hole. "Clever. I must admit, I did not think you had it in you. But it will not work. I own everything around this valley. Every road, every rail line, every supply route. You cannot move water without crossing my land, and I will never give you permission. So you can sit on your aquifer until you die of old age, and it will do you no good whatsoever." "Is that all you came to say?" "No. I came to make one final offer, $100,000, enough to take your pretty bride somewhere civilized, buy her silk dresses, instead of letting her rot in this hovel. You could start over, live like a king." "The answer is no." Marcus's smile vanished. "Then you are choosing death, and you are dragging her down with you." He stepped closer to Ellie, ignoring Daniel's warning growl. Up close, she could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. "When you tire of living in filth, Mrs. Blackwood, my hotel in Blackwater Ridge has running water, hot baths, comfortable beds. You would be welcome." Ellie felt the same cold rage she had felt watching Barlow shovel dirt into her grave. She met Marcus's eyes without flinching. "I prefer the dirt. It is cleaner than your money." Tears streamed down Ellie's face as she spoke, not from fear but from fury, from every moment of degradation under Grayson, from the hole they tried to bury her in, from a lifetime of men who thought they could own her. "I would rather starve in that dirt house with a man who treats me like a human being than live in your palace and be treated like property." Daniel saw her tears and understood. This was not weakness. This was rage finally finding its voice. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Marcus stared at her, his eyes going from amused to something much darker. "You have spirit. I like that. But spirit does not stop bullets, girl. Remember that." He turned to Daniel. 30 days, Blackwood. Sign over the deed or I will take it from your corpse. And this time I mean it." Marcus mounted his horse with practiced ease and wheeled away, his men following. But as they rode out of the valley, Ellie saw one of them turn back, a man with a sheriff's badge. He smiled at her, and it was not a friendly smile. When they were gone, Daniel turned to Ellie. For the first time since she met him, he looked genuinely frightened. "You should not have spoken. He will remember that. He will make you a target." "I am already a target. Grayson wants me dead. Marcus wants you dead. What difference does one more enemy make?" Daniel laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You are either the bravest woman I have ever met or the most foolish." "I have been called worse." They stood together in the gathering dusk, two people who had been strangers a week ago, now bound together by threats neither could escape alone. Around them, the Wyoming wilderness stretched out vast and indifferent, and somewhere in that wilderness, enemies were gathering. The war for Silverstone Ridge had begun, and this time there would be no retreat. The days following Marcus Thornfield's visit passed in tense silence. Daniel increased his patrols around the property, riding the perimeter 3 times a day, with his Winchester across his saddle. Ellie watched him from the window of the sod house, this man who had saved her life now risking his own to protect a secret buried in the earth beneath their feet. On the morning of November 1st, Daniel made a decision. We need to go into town, get supplies before winter sets in. Ellie looked up from the shirt she was mending, one of Daniel's, that had been torn during a fence repair. Is that safe? After what happened with Marcus? Safe or not, we need flour coffee ammunition, and I want people in Blackwater Ridge to see you, to know you exist. If Marcus is planning something, the more witnesses we have to your presence here, the harder it will be for him to make you disappear. The logic was sound but terrifying. Ellie had spent weeks hiding first from Grayson in Boston, now from Thornfield in Wyoming. The idea of deliberately making herself visible went against every survival instinct she had developed. But she was tired of hiding, tired of being afraid. And Daniel was right. Invisibility was not the same as safety. Then I will go. They rode into Blackwater Ridge just after noon. The town was larger than Ellie expected, a sprawling collection of false-fronted buildings clustered around a main street that turned to soup whenever it rained. There was a hotel, 3 saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, and a church that looked like it had been built by people who believed in God, but were not entirely sure he believed in them. Higgins' General Store sat at the corner of Main and Creek Street, a 2-story structure with windows that actually had glass. Daniel tied the horses to the hitching rail and helped Ellie down. She could feel eyes on them already. A woman in frontier trousers was unusual enough. A woman who was clearly from back east, riding with a man everyone knew as the Hermit of Silverstone Ridge, was gossip worth interrupting lunch for. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. The interior smelled of coffee beans, leather, and the peculiar mustiness of dry goods that had traveled too far in too many wagons. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s, broad-shouldered and granite-faced, with eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying all the warmth of a January wind, "did not expect to see you until spring." "Mrs. Higgins, we need supplies." The woman's gaze shifted to Ellie, traveling from her city boots to her carefully pinned hair, taking inventory of every detail with the precision of an accountant totaling a column of figures. "So the rumors are true. You went and got yourself a mail-order bride." It was not a question. "She will be gone by spring. They always are. This country eats city girls for breakfast." Ellie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "I am stronger than I look." "They all say that too." Mrs. Higgins turned back to Daniel. "What do you need?" As Daniel began listing supplies, Ellie wandered the aisles. The store was surprisingly well stocked for such a remote location. Bolts of fabric, canned goods, tools, medicine. And in the back corner, a small selection of ready-made dresses that looked like they had been sewn by someone who understood function but had never met fashion. She was examining a wool dress, calculating whether she could alter it to fit, when she heard the bell above the door chime again. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Conversation stopped. Even Mrs. Higgins, who seemed like the kind of woman who would talk back to a tornado, went quiet. Ellie turned. Marcus Thornfield stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men who wore their guns like some men wore wedding rings, constant, intimate, essential. Marcus himself was dressed as impeccably as before, his suit pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He carried his silver-headed walking stick, though his stride showed no sign of infirmity. It was a prop, a way of saying he could afford affectation. His eyes found Daniel immediately. "Blackwood, what a pleasant surprise. I was just thinking about you." "Marcus." Daniel's voice was flat, empty of inflection. His hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to the pistol at his hip. Marcus noticed. His smile widened. "No need for dramatics. We are all civilized people here." He walked deeper into the store, his stick tapping against the floorboards with metronomic precision. "I was hoping to run into you. Saves me a trip out to that hovel you call a home. Say what you came to say and leave. Always so direct. It is one of the things I admired about you back when we were partners, before you decided that loyalty was negotiable." Marcus picked up a tin of peaches from a shelf, examined the label with theatrical interest, then set it down. "I have been thinking about our last conversation. about your charming bride." He turned to Ellie then, and she felt the full force of his attention. It was like standing in front of a furnace. Overwhelming. Dangerous. "Mrs. Blackwood, may I say you are even lovelier than I remembered. That fire in your eyes, that backbone. Rare qualities out here. Most women who come west either break or become hard as the stones. But you are different." Ellie said nothing. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, to make herself small, to avoid drawing his predatory focus. But she had spent 2 years being small for Vincent Grayson. She was done shrinking. She met his gaze steadily. Marcus laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Oh yes, definitely fire. Tell me, Mrs. Blackwood, what did my former partner tell you about how he acquired that land he is squatting on? Did he explain that we found the aquifer together, that I financed the surveys while he did the grunt work, that we had an agreement to share any discoveries 50-50? "That is a lie," Daniel said quietly. "Is it because I have a contract that says otherwise, signed by both of us in 1871, before you decided to file the deed claim in your name alone?" Ellie looked at Daniel. His face had gone very still, the way prey goes still when the predator is too close to outrun. That contract was for surface discoveries, minerals, timber. The aquifer is groundwater. Different legal category entirely. A technicality you exploited. Some might call that theft. Some might call your attempt to monopolize water rights extortion. The two men stared at each other across the width of the store, years of partnership and betrayal and hatred vibrating in the air between them. Mrs. Higgins had moved behind the counter, her hand below the edge where Ellie suspected a shotgun rested. The other customers had melted away, sensing violence the way animals sense storms. Marcus broke the silence first. "I did not come here to relitigate the past. I came to give you one more opportunity. I am a businessman, not a monster. Sell me the water rights, take the money, disappear with your lovely bride. Start fresh somewhere that does not have such complicated history. And let you bleed every farmer in this valley dry, not a chance. Then you are condemning them anyway, because when I bring the railroad through on the northern route, their land becomes worthless. They will have no way to transport crops, no access to markets. They will starve or sell to me for pennies. Either way, I win. The railroad has not voted yet. No, but they will, and I have made very generous contributions to ensure their decision favors my interests." Daniel's hand was definitely on his pistol now. Marcus's 2 guards' tensed hands dropping to their own weapons. Ellie realized with crystalline clarity that men were about to die in this store, and one of them might be the man who had saved her life. She stepped forward. "Mr. Thornfield." Everyone turned to look at her. She could feel Daniel's silent plea for her to stay quiet, to stay safe, to not draw attention. She ignored it. "You speak of business and contracts and legal technicalities, but I know what you really are. You are a man who mistakes cruelty for strength, who confuses wealth with worth. Daniel told me about your plans to charge farmers $20 a month for water. That is not business. That is extortion. That is watching people suffer because you can profit from their pain." Marcus's smile had frozen on his face. "And what would a little seamstress from Boston know about business? I know that my father borrowed $2,000 from a man not unlike you, a man who charged such usurious interest that the debt doubled every 6 months, a man who valued money more than life. That man drove my father to an early grave, and when I could not pay, he tried to bury me alive." The store was silent. Even Mrs. Higgins had stopped pretending to arrange cans. "Daniel saved me from that hole. He gave me a chance to live when everyone else saw me as something to use or discard. So, yes, Mr. Thornfield, I know exactly what kind of man stands across from me. And I would rather live in a dirt house with an honest man than a mansion with a predator." The silence stretched. Marcus's face had gone from amused to something harder, colder. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of civility. "You have a sharp tongue, Mrs. Blackwood. I wonder if you will still be so brave when winter comes and you are starving. When the wolves are scratching at your door and there is no one to hear you scream, will you still prefer the dirt then, if it means keeping my dignity, yes?" Marcus studied her for a long moment, then turned to Daniel. "You have chosen poorly, old friend. This woman will be your downfall. Mark my words." He moved toward the door, his guards falling in behind him, but he stopped at the threshold and looked back. 30 days, Blackwood, then I stop asking nicely." The door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. Daniel grabbed Ellie's arm, not roughly, but with urgency. "We need to leave, now." "But the supplies—" "Forget the supplies. We need to go before his men set up an ambush on the road," Mrs. Higgins spoke up, surprising them both. "The supplies will be ready in 20 minutes. I will have my son deliver them tonight. Back entrance, no charge." Daniel stared at her. "Why would you help us?" "Because I was married to a good man once. A man who stood up to the Thornfield family when they tried to take his freight business. They burned him out, destroyed everything we had built. I will not watch them do it again if I can help it." She looked at Ellie with something approaching respect. "You have spine, girl. Do not let this country break it." They left through the back door, mounted their horses, and rode out of town at a pace just short of panic. Daniel kept checking behind them, hand never far from his rifle. But no one followed. The road back to Silverstone Ridge was empty, save for wind and dust and the shadows of clouds moving across the land like the ghosts of enormous beasts. They were halfway home when Daniel finally spoke. "You should not have confronted him like that. Marcus is not Vincent Grayson. He does not make empty threats." "Neither do I." "Ellie, he could kill you. He could kill both of us. Then we die fighting." "I am tired of running, Daniel. I ran from Grayson. I ran from Boston. I am not running anymore." He looked at her, then really looked, and she saw something shift in his eyes. Respect, yes, but also fear. Fear of losing her the way he had lost Sarah. "If we fight, you need to be ready for what that means." "Then make me ready." That night, by lamplight in the yard behind the sod house, Daniel taught Ellie to kill. He set up targets again, but this time they were not tin cans. They were man-sized shapes cut from wood and canvas propped up at various distances. He taught her to shoot in darkness, to judge distance by sound, to reload by feel when she could not see. "Never count your shots," he said, standing behind her as she emptied the Winchester into the night. "The moment you think you have one round left is the moment you find out you were wrong. Reload as soon as you have cover." He drilled her again and again. Load, aim, fire, reload. The sequence became automatic, her hands learning the rhythm, even as her mind recoiled from what she was being taught. When she could hit the targets in darkness, 8 times out of 10 Daniel brought out a knife. If you run out of ammunition or the gun jams, you need a backup. He showed her how to hold it, how to thrust upward beneath the ribs where the blade would find the heart, how to slash across major arteries. The instruction was clinical, methodical, and absolutely terrifying. "I cannot do this," Ellie whispered, staring at the blade. "I cannot kill someone with a knife." "You can if the alternative is dying. I saw you shoot at targets. You have steady hands and good instincts. Trust them." They trained until midnight. When Ellie finally went inside, her arms were shaking from exertion, and her mind was numb from the litany of violence she had absorbed. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had become. The seamstress from Boston felt like someone from another lifetime. In her place was this new creature, this woman who could shoot a man at 50 yards and knew exactly where to put a blade to end a life. She was not sure if this was evolution or devolution, but she knew Daniel was right. If Marcus came for them, she needed to be ready. The attack came 3 nights later. Ellie was in the barn forking hay for the horses when she heard the creak of a board behind her. She spun, hand-dropping to the Colt revolver Daniel had given her to wear at all times. A man stood in the doorway, not one of Marcus's well-dressed guards. This was someone rougher, cheaper. A drifter hired for dirty work. He held a knife in one hand and a length of rope in the other. "Boss says you need a message delivered, Mrs. Blackwood. Says you need to understand what happens to women who do not know their place." Ellie did not think, did not hesitate, did not give him time to close the distance. She drew the Colt exactly as Daniel had taught her, both hands on the grip arms extended, breath released. She fired twice. Both rounds hit center mass. The man's eyes went wide with surprise, then empty. He fell backward into the dirt, blood spreading across his chest like spilled ink. Ellie stood frozen, the gun still raised her ears, ringing from the shots. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the copper scent of blood. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice was screaming. She had killed a man. She had taken a life. There was no going back from this. Daniel came running from the house, rifle in hand. He took in the scene in a glance, the dead man. Ellie standing over him, still holding the pistol, the expression on her face that was half horror, half triumph. "Are you hurt?" Ellie shook her head. She could not speak. Her throat had closed around words that refused to form. Daniel gently took the pistol from her hands and pulled her away from the body. He walked her to the house, sat her down, poured her whiskey that burned all the way down. Only then did the shaking start. Great convulsive tremors that rattled her teeth and made her hands useless. "I killed him," she finally managed. "I killed a man." "You defended yourself. He came here to hurt you, to send a message written in your pain. You stopped him. That is not murder. That is survival." "But I did not hesitate. I did not even think. I just pulled the trigger." "That is the training. That is your instincts keeping you alive. Do you feel guilty?" Ellie searched her heart for remorse and found something else entirely. Relief, satisfaction, the certainty that she had made the right choice. "No, I feel like I am still here, like I won. Is that wrong?" "No, that is being human. We are designed to survive. Never apologize for choosing life." They sat together in the lamplight while Daniel explained what would happen next. They would report the attempted assault to the sheriff, though given that the sheriff wore Marcus Thornfield's badge, justice was unlikely. They would bury the body on the property, and they would prepare for the escalation that was surely coming, because Marcus now knew that Ellie was not a helpless city girl. She was armed, trained, dangerous. And that would make him more careful, or more vicious. Daniel was not sure which would be worse. As dawn broke over Silverstone Ridge, painting the valley in shades of gold and blood, Ellie stood outside and looked at her hands. These hands that had sewn wedding dresses and mourning clothes, these hands that had been bound with rope while men shoveled dirt onto her living body, these hands that had now taken a life in defense of the new one she was building. She was not the woman who had left Boston. That woman had died in the hole with the dirt falling on her face. This new Eleanor Blackwood was something harder, something forged in fire and quenched in blood. She did not know yet if she liked this version of herself, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would never be a victim again. And anyone who tried to make her one would discover exactly how much fight a seamstress from Boston could bring to the frontier. The war was no longer coming. It had arrived. The telegram arrived on the morning of November 10th. Daniel had ridden into Blackwater Ridge alone before dawn, unwilling to risk Ellie after the attack 3 nights prior. He returned just after noon with supplies, ammunition, and news that changed everything. "I sent for Sam Garrett. He will be here within the week." Ellie looked up from the shirt she was mending, the same one she had been working on the day Marcus first appeared. Her needle had become a weapon of sorts, each stitch a small act of defiance against the chaos surrounding them. "Your friend from Laramie, the freight hauler. The only man I trust. If we are going to survive what is coming, we need allies. Sam is the closest thing I have to one." She could hear the weight in his voice, the admission of vulnerability. Daniel Blackwood, who had lived alone for 3 years, was acknowledging that solitude was no longer strength. It was suicide. "Will he help us? He hates Marcus almost as much as I do. Thornfield tried to buy out Sam's freight company 5 years ago. When Sam refused, Marcus had his warehouses inspected, found violations that did not exist, fined him into near bankruptcy. Sam survived, but he remembers. Men like him do not forget." 5 days later, a freight wagon crested the ridge and descended into the valley. It was pulled by 4 massive draft horses and driven by a man who looked like he had been carved from the same granite as the mountains around them. Samuel Garrett was 40 years old, with shoulders that could have supported the sky, and a beard that had gone gray from things other than age. 3 men rode alongside the wagon, all armed with repeating rifles, all scanning the terrain with the wariness of soldiers in hostile country. Daniel walked out to meet them, and Ellie watched from the doorway as the two men embraced with the fierce affection of warriors who had survived too many battles together. "Danny boy," Sam's voice was like gravel rolling downhill. "Heard you went and got yourself hitched. Had to see this miracle with my own eyes." "Sam, thank you for coming." Sam's gaze shifted to Ellie, and she felt herself being evaluated with the same thoroughness Mrs. Higgins had employed, but with far more kindness. "So this is the woman who made Marcus Thornfield turn purple with rage in his own general store. Ma'am, that story has traveled all the way to Laramie. You are either the bravest soul in Wyoming or the craziest. I have not decided which." Ellie stepped forward and extended her hand. Sam took it, his grip firm, but not crushing the handshake of someone who understood respect. "Eleanor Blackwood. And I am probably both." Sam laughed, a sound like thunder on a summer afternoon. "I like her already, Danny. She has got spine." They gathered in the bunker that evening, all 6 of them crowded around the drafting table covered with maps. Sam's men stayed topside, keeping watch. In the lamplight, with the weight of stone and earth above them, Daniel laid out the situation with military precision. "Marcus has given us 30 days. That deadline expires in 15. He will not make another offer. He will simply take what he wants." "How many men does he have?" Sam asked. 40, maybe 50. Sheriff Pike and his deputies are all on Thornfield's payroll. The judge in Blackwater Ridge owes Marcus money. We cannot count on the law. So we are looking at a shooting war, unless we can make the war irrelevant. Daniel spread a different map across the table, this one showing railroad routes through the territory. 2 lines were drawn in different colors. One ran north through Marcus's holdings. The other cut south directly through Silverstone Ridge. The Union Pacific Board votes in December on which route to approve for expansion. Southern route needs the aquifer to supply water for construction crews and future stations. Northern route does not, but it is 12 miles longer and crosses unstable mudslide zones. If Southern route wins, Marcus's land becomes worthless. He goes bankrupt. We win without firing a shot. Sam studied the map, his expression skeptical. "And you think the railroad will vote for your route? Marcus has been lobbying that board for 2 years. He has got deep pockets and deeper connections. He has money. I have proof." Daniel pulled out a leather portfolio containing geological surveys, water flow calculations, engineering assessments. Original documentation from 1871 showing that Southern route is faster, cheaper, and safer. "But I need to get these to Cheyenne, to the board president himself. And every road between here and there is watched by Marcus's men. So we fight our way through. No, we go around." Ellie spoke for the first time since they had descended into the bunker. "The river." All eyes turned to her. She moved to the map and traced a thin blue line with her finger. "Medicine Bow River runs from the northern mountains down through Laramie and on to Cheyenne. It passes within 3 miles of here. If we took a boat, a small one, we could bypass every road Marcus controls." Sam was already shaking his head. "The Medicine Bow has rapids this time of year. Class 4, maybe Class 5. People die on that river every season." But Marcus is not watching it. He is watching the roads, the trails. He would never expect us to risk the river. Daniel was staring at her with an expression she could not quite read. Surprise, certainly, but also something deeper, admiration. Perhaps even the beginning of love, though neither of them had spoken that word aloud. "It is insane," Daniel said quietly. "So is everything else we have done," Ellie replied. Sam looked between them, then started to laugh. "You two deserve each other. Fine, we will take the river, but I am not coming with you. Someone needs to hold this homestead while you are gone. If Marcus realizes you have left, he will burn everything to the ground. You would stay here outnumbered 50-1. I brought some equalizers." Sam gestured to one of his men who disappeared up the ladder. Moments later, he returned carrying a heavy wooden crate. Sam pried it open to reveal a weapon that made even Daniel whistle in appreciation. A Gatling gun, 10 barrels, capable of firing 200 rounds per minute, mounted on a wheeled carriage that could be positioned anywhere on the property. "Borrowed it from a contact at Fort Laramie. Figured you might need some persuasive firepower. That will start a war. Danny, the war already started the moment you filed that deed claim. We are just making sure we survive it." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Sam's men fortified the barn, turning it into a genuine defensive position with firing slits and reinforced walls. The Gatling gun was mounted in the hayloft with a clear field of fire covering the valley approach. Ammunition was stockpiled. Escape routes were mapped. And in the evenings after the work was done, Daniel continued training Ellie, but the lessons had evolved. They were no longer just about shooting targets. They were about reading terrain, identifying cover, understanding how to move through hostile territory without being seen. He was teaching her to be a scout, a soldier, a survivor. The next morning, while Daniel was outside checking fences, Ellie returned to the bunker. She needed to understand the full scope of what they were protecting. The aquifer was one piece, but she suspected there were others. In the bottom drawer of the desk beneath the geological samples, she found a second ledger. This one was marked simply UP Union Pacific. She opened it and stared. May 1871, 500 shares purchased, $2,500. August 1872, 1,000 shares purchased, $5,000. January 1874, 3,000 shares purchased, $12,000. September 1875, 5,000 shares purchased, $18,000. Total holdings, 11,500 shares. Current value approximately $45,000. Ellie's hands trembled. Daniel was not just sitting on water rights. He owned enough Union Pacific stock to influence board votes, enough to sway decisions about which routes got built and which got abandoned. When Daniel descended into the bunker that evening, Ellie was waiting with the ledger open. "You are not just defending water. You are manipulating the railroad." Daniel did not deny it. "I bought those shares because I believed the southern route was better, safer. I wanted to have a voice when the vote came." "Is that wrong?" "It is brilliant," Ellie said slowly. "Marcus owns land. You own the company that decides if land matters." He never stood a chance. He stood every chance. He chose greed over partnership. That was his mistake, not mine. On the night of November 12th, 3 days before they were scheduled to attempt the river journey, Daniel asked Ellie to walk with him. They climbed to the ridge above the homestead where the view stretched out across the valley toward mountains whose peaks were already white with early snow. For a long time they stood in silence. Then Daniel spoke. "I need to tell you something. In case things go wrong, in case I do not make it back. Daniel, do not... Please, let me say this." He turned to face her, and in the moonlight his eyes were bright with unshed tears. 3 years ago, when Sarah died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never feel anything again except the weight of grief. I built that bunker, and I hid in it, not just physically but emotionally. I locked myself away from the world because the world had taken everything I loved. He paused, struggling with words that had been buried too long. "And then I saw you in that hole, about to be murdered, and something in me woke up. At first I told myself I was just being decent, just helping someone who needed help. But the truth is you saved me as much as I saved you. You reminded me that life is still worth fighting for, that there are still people worth protecting, that I am not just a ghost haunting my own existence." The tears were falling now, tracking silver lines down his weathered face. "I love you, Eleanor. I know we married for convenience. I know we barely know each other. I know I have no right to feel this way. But I do. I love you, and I needed you to know that before we risk our lives on that river." Ellie felt her own tears beginning. She had suspected, had hoped perhaps, but hearing the words spoken aloud broke something open inside her, something that had been locked tight since her father died, since Grayson's men threw her in that hole. "You are not supposed to say things like that. This was supposed to be a marriage in name only. I know, I am sorry, but I could not die without telling you the truth. Daniel Blackwood, you are the first man who ever treated me like I was worth something beyond my labor or my body. You taught me to fight. You gave me a home. You made me feel human again." She stepped closer, close enough to touch. "I love you too, and I am terrified of that, because everyone I have ever loved has been taken from me. My mother, my father. I cannot lose you too." He pulled her into his arms then, and they held each other on that windswept ridge, two broken people finding wholeness in their shared damage. When they finally kissed, it was not the chaste brush of lips from their wedding day. It was deep, desperate, a promise that neither of them might live to keep but needed to make anyway. They walked back to the homestead, hand in hand, and for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Ellie felt something other than fear or determination. She felt hope. The hope lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, Daniel and Sam rode out to scout the route to the river. Ellie stayed behind, helping Sam's men reinforce the last of the defensive positions. They had been gone perhaps 2 hours when she heard it. Gunshots. Multiple. Distant, but unmistakable. One of Sam's men, a wiry scout named Jenkins, grabbed his rifle and ran toward the sound. Ellie followed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. They found them a mile from the homestead in a narrow canyon that was perfect ambush terrain. Daniel's horse was downshot through the neck. Sam's mount was bucking in circles, its saddle empty. And there, behind a boulder barely large enough to provide cover, Daniel lay bleeding from his left shoulder, while Sam tried to return fire against 5 attackers positioned on the canyon rim above them. Ellie did not think. She ran forward, keeping low, using the terrain the way Daniel had taught her. Jenkins provided covering fire, his rifle cracking in steady rhythm. She reached the boulder and dropped beside Daniel. His face was gray with pain and blood loss. The bullet had hit him high on the left side, just below the collarbone. Not immediately fatal, but he was losing blood fast. "Ellie, get down, get to cover." "I am not leaving you." She tore strips from her own shirt, wadding them against the wound with pressure that made Daniel gasp. Above them, Sam was cursing creatively, firing whenever one of the attackers showed themselves, but they were pinned, trapped, and Daniel was dying by inches. "Listen to me." Daniel grabbed her hand with his good arm, his grip weak but insistent. "There is a tunnel, behind the false wall in the bunker. It leads to the creek. If they overrun the homestead, you take that tunnel. You take the gold from the safe, and you run. You do not look back. I am not leaving you. I already told you that. Eleanor, please. I cannot lose you too. Not like Sarah. Not watching you die while I am helpless to stop it." She looked at him, this man who had pulled her from a grave, taught her to fight, loved her, when she thought love was a luxury she could never afford. And she made a decision. "Then do not die. Because if you die, I am going to drag you back from whatever afterlife you find and kill you again for leaving me." Despite the pain, despite the blood, despite the bullets chipping stone above their heads, Daniel laughed. Jenkins had worked his way up the canyon wall, using his frontier skills to move silently through terrain that should have been impassable. Ellie heard his rifle bark once, twice, and one of the attackers fell from his perch, tumbling down the rocky slope like a broken doll. The remaining 4 realized they were no longer the only hunters. They retreated, mounting horses that had been hidden in the scrub and riding hard toward the north. Sam let them go. He was already down beside Daniel, examining the wound with practiced hands. "Not as bad as it looks. Bullet went through, missed the lung, but he has lost a lot of blood. We need to get him back. Now." They fashioned a travois from coats and rifles, lashed Daniel to it, and dragged him back to the homestead. Every bump made him groan. Every jolt sent fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandages. By the time they got him into the bunker and onto a cot, he was barely conscious. Ellie sent Sam and Jenkins away. This was work she needed to do alone. She stripped Daniel's shirt, cutting it away from the wound. The entry point was ugly ragged, but Sam was right. The bullet had passed through, exiting below the shoulder blade. If infection did not set in, he would live. She worked with the steady precision of someone who had no choice but to succeed. Heated water, cleaned the wound with whiskey that made Daniel scream through gritted teeth. Threaded a needle with silk thread from her sewing kit and began to stitch. Her hands did not shake. The seamstress skills her father had taught her found new purpose, closing human flesh instead of fabric. Each stitch was small, precise, designed to minimize scarring. She worked in silence, and Daniel, despite the pain, watched her face. "You are remarkable," he whispered. "Save your strength. I need to say this. In case I do not get another chance." He paused, gathering breath. "Sarah made me promise to live, but you made me want to. There is a difference. One is obligation, the other is choice. I choose you, Eleanor. Every day, even if we only have a few days left." She finished the final stitch and tied it off. Then she leaned down and kissed him gently, careful not to jar his injury. "Then live, because I choose you too. And I am not done fighting for this life we are building." For 3 days, Daniel fought fever and pain. Ellie barely left his side, changing bandages, forcing water and broth past his cracked lips, monitoring for signs of infection. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. He woke lucid, weak but clear-eyed. "We are running out of time," he said. "The deadline." "I know. Sam says we have 10 days, maybe less. Can I travel?" Ellie looked at the bandaged wound, the pale skin, the man who 3 days ago had been bleeding out in a canyon. Every medical instinct said no. Every strategic instinct said they had no choice. "You can travel, but you cannot fight. Not yet. Then you will have to do the fighting for both of us." They revised the plan that night. Daniel and Ellie would still take the river to Cheyenne, but Sam would provide them with a backup. If the river journey failed, if they could not get the surveys to the railroad board in time, Sam would telegraph every newspaper between here and Washington. He would make Marcus's monopoly public, turn business maneuvering into a scandal that even Thornfield money could not bury. It was not as good as winning the railroad vote, but it was insurance, a backup that might keep them alive long enough to find another way to fight. On November 15th, with Daniel still weak, but insisting he could travel, they prepared to leave. Sam had acquired a logging skiff, 12 feet of reinforced cedar, designed to survive the kind of water that killed ordinary boats. It was waiting 3 miles north, hidden in brush near the river access point. Ellie packed the surveys in an oilskin tube and strapped it across her back. She wore men's trousers, now practical boots, a coat that would not drag in water. She looked nothing like the Boston seamstress who had stepped off the train 6 weeks ago. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone harder, someone who had killed to survive and was prepared to kill again. They said their goodbyes to Sam in the pre-dawn darkness. "Hold the line," Daniel said, "until you get back or until hell freezes over, whichever comes first." Sam gripped Daniel's good shoulder. "You are a pain in the ass, Danny, but you are my friend. Come back alive." "That is the plan." Sam turned to Ellie. "Keep him from doing anything stupid. He has a hero complex." "I noticed." They rode out as the sun breached the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire. Behind them, Sam and his men prepared for siege. Ahead lay 3 miles of dangerous terrain, then a river that had killed better swimmers than either of them, then a journey to Cheyenne that would determine whether they lived free or died fighting. As they rode, Daniel reached over and took Ellie's hand. "Whatever happens on that river, I want you to know something. Meeting you was worth everything. All the pain, all the fear, all of it. We are going to make it, Daniel. We are going to win, and then we are going to build that life you promised me. You believe that? I have to, because the alternative is unacceptable." They rode in silence after that, two people who had found each other in the darkest moments of their lives, now riding toward rapids that might tear them apart. But they rode together, and for now, that was enough. The Medicine Bow River looked different up close. From the ridge it had appeared as a thin blue ribbon winding through the valley, peaceful and inviting. Standing on its banks in the cold November dawn, Ellie saw it for what it truly was, a living thing with teeth. The current moved fast, muscular, pulling at the edges where water met stone with the patience of something that had been carving canyons since before human beings learned to name their fears. The sound was constant, a low roar that made conversation difficult and thought nearly impossible. Daniel stood beside her, his left arm still bound against his chest, his face drawn with pain he refused to acknowledge. The logging skiff rested on the muddy bank 12 feet of cedar that suddenly seemed far too small for the task ahead. "Last chance to reconsider," Daniel said. Ellie looked at him, this man who had saved her from a grave, taught her to fight, loved her when she thought she was beyond loving. Then she looked at the oilskin tube strapped across her back containing the surveys that could end Marcus Thornfield's stranglehold on the valley without a single shot fired. "We go." They pushed the skiff into the water. The current grabbed it immediately, trying to pull it downstream before they could board. Daniel held it steady with his good arm while Ellie climbed in, then hauled himself aboard with a grimace that told her exactly how much his shoulder was screaming. She took the rear position paddle in hand. Daniel sat forward his roll to navigate, to read the water, to call warnings about obstacles she could not see. The first mile was deceptively calm. The river widened. The current slowed, and Ellie began to think that perhaps the danger had been exaggerated. Then she heard it, a sound like distant thunder that grew louder with every paddle stroke. Rapids. "Brace yourself," Daniel called back. "This is Devil's Gate. Keep the nose pointed downstream. Whatever you do, do not let us go sideways." The river narrowed, suddenly compressed between walls of stone that forced the water to accelerate like a liquid bullet. The skiff shot forward, and Ellie's stomach lurched as the bottom seemed to drop away. They were falling, the bow tilting down at an angle that defied reason, water exploding around them in curtains of white spray. A rock loomed ahead, a black tooth jutting from the foam. Daniel shouted something she could not hear over the roar. She paddled hard to the right, muscles burning with effort. The skiff responded, sliding past the rock with inches to spare. The current caught them again, spinning them in a slow circle that threatened to slam them sideways into the canyon wall. Ellie paddled frantically, fighting the river with every ounce of strength she possessed. The skiff straightened. Ahead, the channel split around a massive boulder. Left or right? No time to discuss. No time to think. Left. Daniel's voice cut through the chaos. She steered left. The passage was narrow, barely wider than the skiff. Stones scraped along both sides with a sound like bones breaking. Then they were through, shooting out into a wider pool where the water, having exhausted its fury, rested before gathering strength for the next assault. Ellie's hands were shaking, her shoulders burned. Water sloshed in the bottom of the skiff, cold enough to make her feet ache. "How many more like that?" she managed to gasp. Daniel turned to look at her, and despite everything, he was grinning. 6, maybe 7. That was the easy one. Before she could respond, he held up a hand for silence. In the sudden quiet, they both heard it, distant but unmistakable. Gunfire, coming from the direction of Silverstone Ridge. Marcus had made his move. 3 miles away, Sam Garrett stood in the hayloft of the barn hands on the Gatling gun, watching 20 riders approach from the north. They were not trying to hide. This was not an ambush. This was an execution. At the head of the column rode Marcus Thornfield himself, impeccable, as always, his silver-headed cane tied to his saddle. Beside him, Sheriff Pike carried a rolled document that Sam suspected was some fraudulent warrant giving legal cover to murder. Sam's 3 men were positioned around the property. Jenkins in the sod house with a rifle covering the eastern approach. The other 2, Harrison and Cole, behind reinforced positions with clear fields of fire. 4 men against 20. The mathematics were brutal. But Sam had survived worse odds, and he had made Daniel a promise. The riders stopped 100 yards out, just beyond effective rifle range. Marcus dismounted with theatrical slowness, unrolled the document Pike had carried, and raised his voice to carry across the distance. "Samuel Garrett, by order of the Carbon County Sheriff's Department, you are trespassing on disputed land. Vacate immediately or face arrest for obstruction of justice." Sam leaned out the hayloft window just far enough to be seen. "That is a lie, and you know it, Thornfield. This land belongs to Daniel Blackwood under legal homestead claim. Daniel Blackwood is a fugitive wanted for fraud and theft. His claim is forfeit. More lies. But lies written on official paper, signed by a judge whose gambling debts Marcus owned. In the frontier, the difference between law and lawlessness often came down to who had better lawyers and deeper pockets. "He is not here to defend himself," Sam shouted back. "Come back with a real warrant and a federal marshal." Marcus's smile could be seen even at this distance. "I am afraid we cannot wait. Surrender now, and you will be allowed to leave unharmed. Resist, and we will use necessary force." Sam knew what necessary force meant. It meant corpses buried in shallow graves. It meant making witnesses disappear. It meant Marcus Thornfield rewriting history to suit his purposes. "My answer is no. So be it." Marcus remounted his horse and rode back beyond the ridge. For a moment there was silence. Then the shooting started. 20 rifles opened up simultaneously, a wall of lead that shredded the air and turned the barn into kindling. Sam ducked low as bullets punched through the walls, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. He counted to 3, then rose and spun the Gatling gun's crank. The weapon roared to life, 10 barrels rotating, spitting fire and death at a rate that made single-shot rifles seem quaint. The concentrated firepower swept across the attacker's position like the hand of an angry god. 3 men fell in the first burst, 2 more in the second. The rest scattered, diving for cover behind rocks and scrub brush. Sam traversed the gun, keeping them pinned. Beside him, Harrison was firing methodically from a gap in the wall, his rifle cracking in steady rhythm. Each shot was aimed deliberate. 2 more attackers went down, but there were still 15. And Sam could hear them spreading out, flanking, preparing for a coordinated rush that would overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. On the river, Daniel and Ellie were fighting a different battle. The second set of rapids, which Daniel had optimistically called the Grinder, was living up to its name. The channel was choked with boulders, creating a maze of churning water and stone that offered a dozen ways to die and no clear path to survival. The skiff hit the first rock with enough force to crack the hull. Water began seeping in faster now, pooling around their feet. They had no time to bail. The current was pulling them toward a gap between 2 massive stones, a passage barely wide enough for the skiff to fit through. "Straight," Daniel shouted. "Keep it straight or we flip." Ellie paddled with desperate strength, but the water had other ideas. It caught the stern, tried to spin them sideways. For one terrible moment they were broadside to the current, water piling up against the skiff's side, threatening to roll them. Then Daniel threw his weight to the opposite side, using his body as a counterbalance, despite the agony it sent through his wounded shoulder. The skiff righted. They shot through the gap with the sound of wood scraping on stone and emerged into calmer water beyond. The hull was taking on water seriously now. The crack had widened into a split that ran a third of the length of the boat. "We are sinking," Ellie said, voice tight with controlled panic. "I know, but the worst rapids are behind us. If we can keep bailing and paddling, we might make it to Laramie before we go under. If." The word hung between them like a noose. They fell into a rhythm. Ellie would paddle for 2 minutes while Daniel bailed with a tin cup. Then they would switch. The work was exhausting, monotonous, and absolutely essential. If they stopped, they sank. If they sank, the surveys went to the bottom of the Medicine Bow River, and Marcus Thornfield won. So they did not stop. The sun was past its zenith when they heard a different kind of sound, not rapids, hoofbeats, riders pacing them along the riverbank. Daniel looked up and cursed. 4 men on horseback, wearing the same rough clothes as the attacker who had come for Ellie in the barn. Not Marcus's polished guards. These were hired guns. Drifters paid in cash to do work that could not be traced back to their employer. One of them raised a rifle. The shot kicked up water 3 feet from the skiff. "They are not trying to hit us," Daniel said. "They are hurting us, forcing us toward the bank where they can finish this at close range. Can we outrun them? In a sinking boat, numb." And another shot, this one closer, warning them that the next one would not miss. Ellie made a decision. She stopped paddling and picked up the Winchester that lay wrapped in oilcloth at her feet. Daniel had taught her to shoot from a stable platform. He had not taught her to shoot from a boat that was rocking with every current change while sinking by inches. She would have to improvise. The rifle came up to her shoulder. She aimed not at the riders but at the lead horse. The animal was innocent, but their lives depended on disrupting the pursuit. She squeezed the trigger. The horse screamed and went down, throwing its rider into the scrub. The other 3 riders pulled up momentarily confused. That confusion bought them 30 seconds. 30 seconds of paddling distance. 30 seconds closer to Laramie. The riders recovered and came on harder, spreading out to make themselves more difficult targets. Ellie fired twice more, missing both times. The boat was moving too erratically. The range was too great. She was wasting ammunition. Then the river did what the river always did. It changed. They rounded a bend, and the bank disappeared. The water widened into a marsh where the current spread out and slowed. The riders could no longer pace them. They would have to dismount and pursue on foot through sucking mud and standing water. They chose not to. From the bank, Ellie heard shouting, cursing, the sound of men who had been outmaneuvered by geography. The skiff drifted deeper into the marsh, and the riders fell away, swallowed by distance and cattails. Daniel slumped in relief. That was too close. We are still sinking. I know. But Laramie is only 5 miles downriver. We will make it. They almost did not. The final rapid appeared without warning, a drop where the river fell 8 feet over a limestone shelf. The skiff went over like a barrel going over Niagara. They were airborne for a breathless moment, weightless, the world reduced to sky and spray and the absolute certainty of impact. They hit hard enough to crack ribs. The skiff split completely, breaking in half like a rotten log. Daniel and Ellie were thrown into the water cold enough to stop the heart, deep enough to drown in. Ellie went under the weight of her soaked clothes, pulling her down. Her boots filled with water, heavy as anchors. She kicked desperately, lungs already screaming for air. The oilskin tube with the surveys was still strapped across her back, and in that moment of terror she almost unclipped it, almost let it sink to save herself. But she had not come this far to fail now. She kicked harder, broke the surface, gasping, saw Daniel 20 feet downstream, struggling to stay afloat with only one good arm. Between them, the remains of the skiff were already sinking, disappearing into the brown water like a dream dissolving at dawn. Ellie swam. Not well, not gracefully, but with the grim determination of someone who had already been buried once and refused to stay dead. She reached Daniel, got an arm around him, and together they made for the shore. They crawled onto the muddy bank, more dead than alive. For long minutes they simply lay there, coughing up river water, shaking with cold and exhaustion and the aftermath of fear. Finally Daniel spoke. "Did you keep the surveys?" Ellie reached back and felt the oilskin tube still secured, still intact. "Yes." "Then we won. Everything else is just details." Those details included walking 5 miles to Laramie in wet clothes in November. By the time they staggered into the town, Ellie's lips were blue and Daniel's wound had reopened, blood seeping through his shirt. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck, which, in a sense, they were. The Union Pacific office was a brick building on the main street, imposing and official. Ellie pushed through the door with Daniel leaning on her shoulder and faced a receptionist whose expression went from annoyance to shock in the space of a heartbeat. "We need to see Board President Hill. Now." "He is in Cheyenne, ma'am." "I can arrange a telegram." "We will go to Cheyenne. We need horses, fresh ones, and a telegraph to announce our arrival." The receptionist looked at them, at their soaked clothes, at Daniel's blood-stained shirt, at Ellie's eyes, which held the kind of determination that did not take no for an answer. "I will arrange it immediately." 2 hours later, on horses borrowed from the railroad's stable, they were riding the final 40 miles to Cheyenne. Daniel was barely conscious, kept in the saddle only by Ellie's constant vigilance. But they rode, because stopping meant giving Marcus time to interfere, and they had no time left to give. At Silverstone Ridge, Sam Garrett was down to his last 30 rounds for the Gatling gun. Jenkins was dead killed by a lucky shot through the window of the sod house. Harrison had taken a bullet to the leg and was holding the eastern position through sheer stubbornness. Cole was still fighting from the barn's ground floor, but Sam could hear Marcus's men moving closer, using the smoke from burning outbuildings as cover. It was only a matter of time. Sam cranked the Gatling gun one more time, sweeping fire across the advancing line. He bought them another minute, another yard of retreat. But mathematics was mathematics. Eventually, the numbers would win. He thought about Daniel, about the promise he had made to hold this ground. He had kept that promise for 6 hours. 6 hours of continuous combat. 6 hours of men screaming and dying. 6 hours that felt like 6 lifetimes. As he reloaded the last belt of ammunition, Sam Garrett smiled. If this was how he went out protecting a friend's home against a tyrant's greed, then it was a death with meaning, better than he had any right to expect. He cranked the gun, fired, cranked, fired, making every round count, and waited for the end. In Cheyenne, Ellie and Daniel stumbled into the Union Pacific headquarters as the sun was setting. Board President James Hill was waiting, alerted by the telegram from Laramie. He took one look at them and called for a doctor. "The surveys first," Ellie said, unstrapping the oilskin tube with hands that shook from exhaustion. "Please." Hill opened the tube, unrolled the documents, and spread them across his desk. For 10 minutes he read in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at them. "These are extraordinary. Original geological surveys showing stable bedrock along the entire southern route, water flow calculations that would supply 3 construction camps simultaneously, engineering assessments that make the northern route look like folly." He paused. "Why did you not present these years ago?" "Because Marcus Thornfield would have killed me," Daniel said simply, "and he is trying to kill you now. He has 40 men attacking my homestead as we speak. My friend is defending it alone." Hill's face hardened. He turned to his assistant. "Telegraph the U.S. Marshal in Carbon County. Armed assault on federal homestead claim, federal jurisdiction. I want deputies there within 2 hours." He looked back at Daniel and Ellie. "The board votes tomorrow. I cannot guarantee the outcome, but I can guarantee these surveys will be presented, and I can guarantee federal protection for your property." It was not everything, but it was enough. Ellie watched Hill's assistant send the telegrams, each click of the key a lifeline thrown across the miles to Sam Garrett. "Hold on," she thought. "Just a few hours more. We did it. We got the surveys through. We won. Now they just had to survive long enough to claim the victory." Hill arranged rooms for them at a hotel. A doctor came, rebandaged Daniel's shoulder, pronounced him lucky to be alive. Ellie sat beside the bed holding Daniel's good hand, and for the first time in weeks allowed herself to believe they might actually live through this. "We made it," Daniel whispered. "Sam made it possible. He is still out there, still fighting. He is the toughest man I know. If anyone can survive until the marshals arrive, it is Sam." Ellie wanted to believe that, needed to believe it, but she had seen the mathematics. 4 men against 40. No amount of toughness could overcome those odds forever. She closed her eyes and prayed to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore. Prayed for Sam, for Harrison and Cole, for all the good men bleeding to protect a principle. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw Vincent Grayson's face, saw Marcus Thornfield's predatory smile, saw all the men who thought they could buy and sell human lives like livestock. They were wrong. She had proven that by surviving the hole they tried to bury her in, by learning to fight when they expected her to break, by riding rapids that should have killed her to deliver documents that would destroy them. Tomorrow the Union Pacific Board would vote, and the day after that she and Daniel would go home. Back to Silverstone Ridge, back to the bunker and the sod house and the life they were building from the wreckage of their pasts. Back to face whatever final reckoning awaited. But tonight, they rested. And far away under a Wyoming sky, bleeding sunset colors, Sam Garrett fired his last round and prepared to meet whatever came next with his fists and his fury and his unbreakable promise to a friend. The war was not over, but the tide had turned, and in the end that would make all the difference. Sam Garrett had stopped counting rounds. He had stopped counting casualties. He had stopped counting the minutes until death found him. All that remained was the mechanical act of cranking the Gatling gun, watching men fall, and waiting for the inevitable moment when the ammunition ran dry, and Marcus Thornfield's forces overran his position. That moment came at sunset. The final belt of ammunition fed through the gun, each round a prayer answered, each hit a small victory in a battle already lost. Then the mechanism clicked empty. The rotating barrels spun uselessly, hungry mouths with nothing left to bite. Sam released the crank and picked up his rifle. 6 rounds remaining. He would make them count. Below him, Marcus's men were gathering for the final push. They had learned respect for the Gatling gun's reach. Now seeing it silent, they found courage in numbers. 20 men rose from cover and began advancing across the blood-soaked yard. Sam killed the first man at 200 yards, the second at 175. The third shot missed. The fourth dropped a man at 50 yards who was carrying a torch probably meant to burn what little remained standing. 2 rounds left. He was selecting his 5th target when he heard it. But before the sound of hoofbeats registered, Sam allowed himself one moment, one breath. He thought about Danny, about the kid he had pulled from a snowstorm in 73 half-frozen, delirious, clutching survey maps like they were treasure. About watching that kid become a man, fall in love with Sarah, bury Sarah, die inside for 3 years, and then come back to life because of a woman named Eleanor. Sam's eyes burned with tears he would never admit to shedding. If he died here, at least it would be for something that mattered, for friendship, for the principle that some things could not be bought. "Come on then, you bastards," he whispered, tears mixing with gunpowder residue on his face. "Let's finish this." Then he heard the hoofbeats, a sound that did not belong to this battle. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming fast from the south. The attackers heard it too. They stopped their advance uncertain. Marcus rode forward from his command position on the ridge, face twisted with fury that his men had hesitated. Then the riders crested the southern rise. 12 men wearing U.S. Marshal badges, federal authority backed by federal weapons. They did not announce themselves with words. They announced themselves with a volley of rifle fire that cut through Marcus's forces like a scythe through wheat. The battle ended in the space of a heartbeat. Marcus's hired guns threw down their weapons and raised their hands. These were men who would fight for money, but not against federal officers who could track them across state lines and drag them back to hang. Marshal Haddock, a man built like a grain silo with a voice to match, rode directly to where Marcus sat, his horse face pale, with the realization that he had finally overreached. "Marcus Thornfield, you are under arrest for armed assault on federal homestead claim, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and about a dozen other charges I will think of on the ride back to Cheyenne." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, probably to invoke lawyers or political connections or the complex web of influence he had spent decades weaving. Haddock cut him off. "You can talk to the federal judge. Right now you are going to shut your mouth and put your hands out for these shackles." For the first time in perhaps his entire adult life, Marcus Thornfield had no leverage, no escape route, no way to buy or threaten his way clear. He was simply a man who had broken federal law in front of federal witnesses, and the machinery of justice was about to grind him into powder. Sam emerged from the barn bleeding from a dozen minor wounds, his clothes black with powder burns and other men's blood. He saw Marcus in chains and started to laugh. It hurt his ribs, probably cracked from diving behind cover too many times, but the laughter felt necessary, cathartic. "How does it feel, Thornfield, being on the wrong end of power for once?" Marcus looked at Daniel, and for the first time something other than hatred flickered across his face. "The investors," Marcus said quietly, "the 200 families who bought land from me. When I go bankrupt, they lose everything. Their life savings, their futures." Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then, "I will buy their contracts, fair market price. They keep their land." Marcus stared. Why would you do that for people who supported me?" "Because Catherine would have wanted me to. She believed in helping people. You told me that yourself." Marcus's composure cracked. His shoulders sagged. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I failed her. I thought controlling water would honor her memory, but I just became another tyrant." "You can still make it right," Ellie said. "When you get out, there will be work, managing the water cooperative, helping the families you nearly destroyed. It is not too late for redemption." Marcus looked at her with something approaching hope. Then the marshals led him away. That somehow, someway, he would find revenge. He never got the chance. 200 miles away in Cheyenne, Daniel and Ellie woke to news that the marshals had arrived at Silverstone Ridge in time. Sam was alive. The homestead was secure. Marcus was in custody. "We won," Ellie whispered, hardly believing it. "Not yet. The board votes this afternoon. Until then, Marcus still has allies who might try to salvage his position." They spent the morning preparing. Daniel's shoulder was healing, but still weak. Ellie helped him into a clean shirt the first time in weeks either of them had worn clothing that was not stained with mud or blood. They looked almost civilized, almost like the people they had been before Wyoming had remade them. At 2 o'clock they were summoned to the Union Pacific boardroom. It was an impressive space, all dark wood and brass fixtures designed to remind visitors that they were in the presence of industrial power. 9 men sat around a massive table, each representing different financial interests in the railroad's expansion. James Hill stood and addressed the room. Gentlemen, we have before us two competing proposals for the southern expansion route. The first, championed by Marcus Thornfield, runs north through his holdings. The second runs south through land controlled by Daniel Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood has provided geological surveys that were not available when we last discussed this matter. I have asked him here to present his findings. Daniel stood favoring his injured shoulder and spread the maps across the table. Gentlemen, the southern route is 12 miles shorter. It crosses stable bedrock instead of mudslide-prone shale, and most importantly, it provides access to the Silverstone Aquifer, which can supply water for 3 construction camps simultaneously without the need for expensive transport infrastructure. One of the board members, an older man with mutton-chop whiskers, leaned forward. Mr. Blackwood, I understand there has been considerable conflict over this land. Armed conflict. How can we be assured that choosing your route will not embroil the Union Pacific in a range war, because the man who started that war is currently in federal custody? Marcus Thornfield attacked my homestead with 40 armed men. Federal marshals have arrested him and his Keogh conspirators. The conflict is over. But you own the water rights. What prevents you from charging extortionate rates once we are committed to your route? This was the question Daniel had been expecting. The question that could sink everything, even if the technical merits favored his proposal. He looked at Ellie. She nodded. I am prepared to sign the water rights over to a public trust, managed by county officials with rates capped by territorial statute. I want nothing except fair compensation for easement rights across my land. The water belongs to the people who need it, not to whoever happens to own the deed. The room went silent. This was not how frontier landowners behaved. You secured an advantage and you exploited it. You extracted maximum profit from every opportunity. Altruism was for fools and saints, and neither survived long in the territories. But Daniel Blackwood was offering something different, a partnership instead of a hostage situation, trust instead of coercion. Hill broke the silence. Gentlemen, I recommend we vote. The vote was not even close. 7 in favor of the southern route, 2 abstentions, 0 opposed. They had won. Daniel and Ellie walked out of that boardroom into the November afternoon, knowing that everything had changed. Marcus Thornfield's empire was in ruins. The homestead was secure. The water would serve the people instead of enriching a tyrant. They had survived. But the story was not quite finished. They were packing to leave Cheyenne the next morning when the hotel clerk knocked on their door. A man was asking for Mrs. Blackwood. He had come a long way and said it was urgent. Ellie felt ice form in her stomach. She knew before the clerk even described the visitor who it would be. Vincent Grayson had come to collect his debt. He was waiting in the hotel lobby, immaculately dressed, despite what must have been weeks of travel. Beside him stood Barlow, still limping from the bullet Daniel had put in his leg 2 months ago in Boston, and flanking them were 2 more men, rough frontier types, who wore their guns like they knew how to use them. Grayson smiled when he saw Ellie descending the stairs. It was the same predatory smile she remembered from Boston, the smile of a man who had never been told no and did not intend to start now. Eleanor Ashford, or should I say Eleanor Blackwood. Though I suspect that marriage is as fraudulent as everything else about your flight from justice. Daniel moved to stand beside Ellie, his hand near his pistol. Grayson noticed, and his smile widened. Please, no theatrics. We are civilized people. I simply came to collect what is owed. $2,000 plus accumulated interest. $4,800 total. Pay that sum and you never see me again. Refuse and I invoke my legal right to claim compensation through indentured servitude as specified in the original loan contract your father signed. That contract died with my father. Actually, it did not. Debts transfer to heirs. It is territorial law. You can ask any lawyer. Grayson pulled a document from his coat. I have a court order from Massachusetts authorizing me to collect by any means necessary. Daniel stepped forward. She is under my protection, and your authority ends at the state line. Does it? Because I also have a federal warrant. It seems there was a murder in Boston the night Mrs. Blackwood disappeared. A man named Jenkins found dead in an alley with a bullet wound. The bullet matches the caliber of a pistol later reported stolen from Eleanor Ashford's residence. It was a lie, all of it, fabricated evidence, false testimony. the machinery of legal corruption that men like Grayson wielded as expertly as Daniel wielded a surveyor's tools. But it was a lie backed by official documents, and in the space between truth and power, lies often won. "What do you want?" Ellie asked quietly. "I want my money, or I want you. One or the other. The choice is yours." Daniel's hand moved toward his gun. Barlow and the two hired men responded instantly, weapons clearing leather. But Grayson held up a hand, stopping them. "Please, Mr. Blackwood, let us not turn this hotel into an abattoir. I am a businessman, not a barbarian. Give me the money, and this ends peacefully." "I do not have that much cash." "Then I am afraid Mrs. Blackwood will need to come with me. The indentured servitude contract specifies 10 years of labor to satisfy the debt. She is young, healthy. She will survive it, probably." The casual cruelty of it, the absolute certainty that he would win because he always won, broke something in Ellie. She had survived being buried alive, had learned to fight, had killed to protect herself, had ridden rapids that should have drowned her. She was done being a victim. "Step outside," she said. "We settle this now." Grayson looked delighted. "A duel how frontier. But, my dear, you are not armed." Ellie reached beneath her coat and drew the Colt revolver Daniel had given her. The one she had used to kill Marcus's hired man in the barn. The one she had cleaned and loaded every night since. "I am now." The hotel lobby cleared. Guests fled. The clerk dove behind his desk. This was the West. Everyone knew what came next. They walked into the street 4 against 2. The mathematics should have favored Grayson, but mathematics did not account for rage, for all the fear and humiliation and pain that Ellie had endured under this man's shadow. They stood 20 paces apart. The sun was setting, painting the street in shades of blood. "Last chance," Grayson said. "Walk away from this frontier trash and come with me. I might even forgive the interest." "Go to hell." Grayson sighed. "Barlow, kill the husband. I will handle the wife." 4 men drew, but Ellie was faster. She had spent weeks training with Daniel, learning to read the micro-movements that preceded a draw, the shift of weight, the tensing of shoulders, the moment when intention became action. She saw Barlow's hand move and fired before his gun cleared leather. The first round took him in the chest. The second fired as she pivoted, hit one of the hired men in the throat. Daniel had drawn simultaneously, his speed terrifying despite the injured shoulder. He fired twice. Both hired men went down. That left Grayson, the man who had driven her father to death, who had tried to bury her alive, who had chased her across a continent because he believed he owned her. He was fumbling with his pistol, his city-bred hands slow and clumsy. Ellie walked toward him, gun raised, and for the first time in her life, she saw fear in Vincent Grayson's eyes. "You cannot," he gasped. "I have legal authority. Killing me is murder." "No," Ellie said calmly. "Killing you is freedom." She shot him twice. Center mass. The way Daniel had taught her. The way that put men down and kept them down. Grayson fell into the dust of a Wyoming street 3,000 miles from Boston and bled out in the gathering dark. Ellie stood over him, gun still raised, and felt nothing. No remorse, no guilt, just a vast, overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. The ghost that had haunted her since her father died was finally laid to rest. Marshal Haddock arrived within the hour, having ridden hard from Silverstone Ridge with Marcus Thornfield in chains. He interviewed witnesses, examined the bodies, read the fraudulent warrant Grayson had carried. His verdict was delivered in the deadpan tone of a man who had seen too much frontier justice to be surprised by any of it. Self-defense, 4 against 2. Witnesses confirmed Grayson's men drew first. Case closed. Daniel and Ellie rode out of Cheyenne the next morning. Behind them, undertakers were preparing 4 graves. Ahead, the valley of Silverstone Ridge waited scarred but standing. They rode in silence for the first hour. Then Ellie spoke. "I killed 4 men in 2 months. The man in the barn. Grayson and his people. That is not who I was. That is not who I wanted to become." Daniel reached over and took her hand. "You are not a killer. You are a survivor. There is a difference. Killers seek out violence. Survivors defend themselves when violence finds them. You did not want any of this, but you faced it with more courage than most men would have shown. Do you think it gets easier, the nightmares, the memories? No, I think we learn to carry them, the way I carry Sarah's memory, not as a burden, but as proof that we loved enough to be broken by loss, and strong enough to rebuild. They reached Silverstone Ridge 3 days later. The valley looked like a battlefield. The sod house was gutted by fire. The barn was riddled with bullet holes. Scorch marks showed where smaller buildings had burned to their foundations. But Sam Garrett stood in the middle of the wreckage, very much alive, grinning like a man who had just won a bet with death. "Took you long enough. I was starting to think you drowned." "We nearly did," Daniel said, dismounting carefully. "Sam, I do not know how to thank you. Do not. We are even now. I owed you for 73 when you pulled me out of that snowstorm. Consider the debt paid." Sam had already started rebuilding. The frames for a new house were going up proper timber construction instead of sod. A real barn was being planned. The men who had survived the battle, Harrison and Cole, were working alongside Sam, transforming destruction into foundation. "Railroad sent a telegram," Sam said. "Southern route is approved. Construction begins in spring. They want to negotiate easement rights and water access. Sounds like you are about to become very rich, Danny." "We are putting the water in a public trust." Sam stared at him. "You fought a war for that aquifer, and you are just giving it away." "Not giving it away, giving it back. To the people it was always meant to serve." Sam shook his head in amazement. "You are either the noblest man in Wyoming or the dumbest. I have not decided which." That night Ellie and Daniel sat on the ridge above the valley, watching the sun set over land that was finally truly theirs. No one was hunting them, no one was trying to kill them. The wars, both legal and literal, were over. Daniel turned to Ellie and saw tears streaming down her face. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. Everything is finally right." She wiped her eyes, laughing through the tears. "When I left Boston, I thought I was running away, escaping. But I was not running from something. I was running toward this, toward you, toward home." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. "I spent 3 years thinking I had lost my home when Sarah died," Daniel said quietly. "I thought home was a place, a house, a piece of land, but it is not. Home is the people you choose, the life you build together. You are my home, Eleanor. Not this valley, not the house we will rebuild. You." She kissed him then, and for the first time since her father died, Ellie felt complete, whole, as if all the broken pieces of her life had finally been hammered into something new and stronger than before. "I love you, Daniel Blackwood, more than I thought I could love anything, and I love you. From the moment I pulled you from that hole, I think some part of me knew. You were not just someone to save, you were someone to build a life with." They sat together as darkness fell, watching stars emerge like punctuation marks in the vast narrative of the sky. Behind them, they could hear Sam and his men working, the sound of hammers and saws, writing the first chapter of whatever came next. 5 years passed like a river flowing to the sea, inevitable, unstoppable, transformative. By 1880, the sod house was a memory. In its place stood a 2-story timber home with glass windows and a wraparound porch. The barn was sound and painted, housing horses and cattle instead of secrets. The valley had filled with life, homesteaders drawn by the promise of affordable water and railroad access. A small town was growing at the confluence of the valley and the rail line, with a general store, a school, and a church. The Blackwood Water Cooperative served 400 families at $5 a month. The profits after maintenance costs went into a community fund that built roads and schools and helped new settlers get established. Daniel Blackwood was no longer a hermit. He was a respected landowner, a county commissioner, a man whose opinion carried weight in territorial politics. But he had not changed in the ways that mattered. He still wore his boots until they fell apart, still preferred horses to carriages, still believed that wealth was worthless if it did not serve something larger than itself. Ellie had changed more. The frightened seamstress from Boston was gone entirely. In her place stood a woman who managed the water cooperative's accounts taught at the school when the regular teacher was ill and had become something of a legend in the territory. The woman who had killed Vincent Grayson in a fair fight. The woman who had ridden the Medicine Bow Rapids to save her husband's land. The woman who proved that courage had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with choosing to stand when it would be easier to run. They had children, 3 of them. Sarah named after the woman who had made Daniel promise to live again. Thomas named after Ellie's father. And Samuel named after the friend who had held the line when everything depended on it. On a spring morning in 1880, Daniel and Ellie stood on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Sarah was 6, already showing her mother's determination and her father's love of maps. Thomas was 4, wild as the wind and twice as unpredictable. Baby Samuel was learning to walk, taking tentative steps before falling into the grass with delighted laughter. Sam Garrett was visiting as he did every few months. He had married a widow from Laramie and built a freight empire that rivaled anything Marcus Thornfield had constructed. But he still made time for the friends who had fought beside him. "You two did it," Sam said, leaning against the porch rail. "Built something real, something that will last." "We survived," Daniel corrected. "Everything else just followed." "More than survived. You won. Against Grayson. Against Marcus. Against odds that should have crushed you. And you did it without becoming the thing you fought against. That is rare, Danny. Rarer than you know." Ellie looked out at the valley, at the homes dotting the landscape, at the rail line, bringing commerce and connection. She thought about the woman she had been, the one in the hole, certain she was about to die. If that woman could see this, if she could know that the nightmare would end in this kind of peace, would she have believed it possible? What happened to Marcus, she asked. Sam would know. He made it his business to know things. Died in prison last year, pneumonia. They buried him in the prison cemetery. No family came. No one claimed the body. He spent 40 years building an empire, and it all came to nothing in the end. "I should feel something," Ellie said. "Pity maybe, or satisfaction, but I just feel empty when I think about him." "That is because he does not matter anymore," Daniel said. "He was a chapter in our story, but not the ending." Sarah ran up to the porch holding a grasshopper cupped carefully in her small hands. "Papa, Mama, look. I caught it, but I am going to let it go, because it wants to be free." Ellie knelt down and kissed her daughter's forehead. "That is very kind, sweetheart. Everything deserves to be free." As Sarah released the grasshopper and watched it leap away into the tall grass, Ellie felt Daniel's hand find hers. 5 years married, a lifetime of shared scars and hard-won peace. They had been strangers once, 2 broken people stumbling toward each other in the dark. Now they were home. The sun climbed higher in the Wyoming sky, warming the valley that had been bought with blood and courage and the stubborn refusal to stay buried. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, carrying the promise of connection, of commerce, of a future being written one rail tie at a time. They had fought for this, bled for it, nearly died for it. And in the end, they had won something more valuable than water rights or railroad contracts or victory over enemies. They had won each other. They had won a life worth living. They had won home. And in the broken, beautiful, dangerous frontier of 1880 Wyoming, that was the greatest treasure of all. The seamstress and the surveyor. The woman buried alive and the man who pulled her free. They had remade themselves in fire and water and become something neither could have imagined. They had become whole, and that was how their story ended. Not with conquest, but with peace. Not with wealth, but with love. Not with revenge, but with release. 2 people who had every reason to give up had chosen instead to fight, to build, to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. And they had been right. The sun set on Silverstone Ridge, painting the valley gold. Inside the house, children laughed. On the porch, Daniel and Ellie sat together, hands clasped, watching the day surrender to darkness. They had survived the water wars. They had built an empire of kindness in a land that worshipped cruelty. They had proven that the most dangerous weapon was not a gun or money or power. It was 2 people who refused to be broken, and that truth would outlast them both, written into the land itself, carried forward by children who would tell their children the story of how love conquered fear, how courage defeated greed, how 2 strangers became family, the story of the Water King and his bride, the story of home. The end.